Hi, this is Mercedes Bern-Klug with the University of Iowa School of Social Work, and I'm here today to talk with somebody who knows a lot about people who are being deported from the United States. So he's going to introduce himself and then tell a little bit about two cases that are particularly emblematic. Okay?
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Voisine. I'm on a Fulbright grant here in Mexico. I'm doing a master's at the UNAM where I'm studying LGBTQ plus migration. Before the Fulbright, I had worked for a while at a number of nonprofits in the U.S. that supported immigrants and refugees. So the two cases that I think that are really interesting and that kind of like are emblematic in the sense of like deportation and how it affects certain groups, especially older folks, is the deportation of veterans from Mexico who served in various U.S. wars and who have been deported, and also the case of refugees from the Vietnam War, many of whom were brought to the U.S. And who constructed a life in the U.S. and recently have found themselves in jeopardy. Have found themselves being threatened to be deported by the U.S. government back to Vietnam. So I'll start with the case of veterans from Mexico who have been deported. But before I talk about that case, I want to give like a little brief overview of citizenship in the U.S. because in both cases, one of the reasons why these folks are even deportable in the first place is because they weren't able to apply for U.S. citizenship. Many of them were eligible or are eligible, but there's a number of barriers to citizenship that have affected their ability to get the status that would protect them from deportation. So with the citizenship process, I actually used to work at a nonprofit in Boston, it was a nonprofit that supported individuals who were looking to apply for citizenship and who didn't have a lot of income, right? Who lower income folks who didn't have the legal support to tackle the application or the financial support to pay for the application. So some of the barriers that we saw to citizenship at that nonprofit in Boston was definitely just a lack of knowledge about the citizenship process, the different steps that are involved. The citizenship process is expensive as well. So a lot of folks weren't able to afford it and just kind of gave up because they didn't think that they'd be able to pay for the application itself. There are some fee waivers for folks who make under a certain amount of income, but that information unfortunately isn't really diffused sufficiently, so people don't know about it. And also the fee waiver process is difficult. And the Trump administration has recently increased the cost of the citizenship application and has made it more difficult to apply for fee waivers. So these issues are, I think, going to get worse in the next few years. I think also accessibility to nonprofits that support people who are applying for citizenship is also an issue. If you're not living in like a big metropolitan area, it's more difficult to find these organizations. The application itself is, I believe it's more than 20 pages. I think it's around 25, 26 pages. And it's a lot of information in a very bureaucratic English, and it can be difficult to parse through that. So a lot of people see the application and they just give up right away because it's a long application. English and knowing enough about U.S. civics are also two other factors that dissuade a lot of people. And I think this disproportionately affects older folks, as I saw in Boston, having to study for the exam, having to be able to speak a sufficient level of English. There are certain ways to get a waiver to not have to speak English during your exam, or to not have to take the civics part of the exam, but that waiver is very difficult, and it definitely requires support from somebody who's very knowledgeable with the process. So all that is to say that there's a lot of barriers to citizenship. And interestingly enough, when we crunched the numbers for the Boston area, only about 10% of people who are eligible for citizenship were actually applying for citizenship. And I can tell you anecdotally as well that a lot of people who were applying were generally younger and had been in the U.S. for shorter amounts of time. So older folks, people who had been in the U.S. for a really long time, are the populations that were the most difficult to access and applied for citizenship at a lower rate. So all that is to say that there's a lot of barriers to citizenship, despite the fact that citizenship is the only protection against deportation. So moving on to the case of Mexicans who have been deported, I will say too that there are veterans from a wide number of countries who have served in the U.S. military and who have been deported or who are at risk of deporting. I'm most familiar with the case of Mexico, but there's definitely other countries where this is happening as well.
Alex, can I ask you a question that just occurred to me? So in order to serve in the U.S. military, you don't have to be a citizen?
You do not. No, you have to, you can be a legal permanent resident, and you have to like renounce your citizenship when you do. It's weird because usually when you get citizenship, you renounce your past citizenship. But when you enter the U.S. military, you have to sign this paper that says, I'm loyal to the U.S. and I won't, I'll defend the interests of the U.S. over my home country. But yeah, folks who don't have citizenship can serve in the U.S. military.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Great. So the case of Mexican veterans who have been deported. So there's definitely a wide range of people. I think a lot of the older folks that are in this situation of having been deported were brought to the U.S. At a really young age. So they have definitely a sense of community in the U.S., a social network, a family network, right? And they've kind of built a life for themselves in the U.S. And in a couple cases, actually, a few cases, people were told that, people who didn't have U.S. citizenship were told that if you serve in the U.S. military, then you'll automatically get citizenship. And that actually is not the case at all. You have to still apply for citizenship, and it's a difficult process. So there's some misinformation there, which I think is important. But I think in the vast majority of cases, people just haven't applied because of the barriers to citizenship that I'd mentioned before. One of the cities that a lot of folks have been deported to in Mexico is Tijuana, and obviously Tijuana right now is, and I think historically has always been a city filled with immigrants from various different parts of the country, filled with people who have been returned or deported. Right now, I think it's gotten a lot more complicated because of the migrant protection protocols, which is a program that the U.S. Recently launched, in which Central American asylum seekers have to stay in Mexico as they're waiting for their application. So there's about 60,000, I think even more than 60,000 Central American asylum seekers who are now in Tijuana, in a number of other border cities. And because there's so many people, the few albergues, the few shelters that are there are filled. So for folks who have been deported, who historically would have found themselves in those shelters or would have been eligible to stay in those shelters, are finding that those shelters are completely full. So there's a lot of competition for spaces in these shelters, and it affects refugees, immigrants, and also folks who have been deported. There also are a few, there's a very small support network in Tijuana and the other border cities for folks who have been deported, especially for older folks. There are a couple organizations, but they're under-resourced and understaffed. Especially for older folks who've been deported, there are a lot of issues at play that kind of hinder their ability to reinsert themselves into the labor market in Mexico, and to get a sense of community. So like I mentioned before, a lot of folks have been living in the US for a long time, established a life and had a job in the US. When you're deported then to a country that you barely know, and then told that you have to find a job and access the health system, right? Like it's a very, very difficult process. And I think for older folks, it's even more difficult because of age discrimination in Mexico that, happens in all parts of Mexico, but in a place like Tijuana, where there's a lot of immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and deportees kind of competing over a finite amount of jobs. The factor of age discrimination puts older folks at even more of a disadvantage. And I think also one big issue is accessing the health system too. So when veterans have been deported, they're not able to bring their pensions with them. And they're also not able, of course, to access the VA health system. So they're kind of just left in Mexico with whatever savings they have, and with very little information about how to access the health system. And I think this is particularly difficult, especially for folks who have been seeing the same doctor for a long time, who have been seeing a doctor who's familiar with their profile and the sorts of medications they've been taking, to then have to go to a new country, find a new doctor, explain your entire history to that doctor, and also find out a way to get access to the healthcare system, which in Mexico is very difficult, right? These things make the integration process super, super complicated. And yeah, so I think that like that series of factors, right, creates these sorts of situations where anybody who's been deported finds themselves in a difficult sort of reintegration process. But that integration process, I think, is experienced differently and in some ways more difficultly by older folks and other minorities. The case of Vietnamese war refugees is slightly different. Partially because of the distance between the U.S. and Vietnam, but I think it's also a really important case to talk about. So the U.S. and Vietnam, they established diplomatic relations in 1995. And since then, there's been a program to kind of allow for those who were fleeing the war in Vietnam, refugees who were fleeing the war in Vietnam, to stay in the U.S. And people who have fled, who are fleeing the war in Vietnam, it's a wide range of people. So everyone from, the children of people who had allied themselves with the South Vietnamese forces or with the U.S. military, to people who just were fleeing the atrocities of the Vietnam War. And folks who came in the 60s and the 70s, right? So folks who are now a little bit older and who have, in many cases, been living in the U.S. for a really long time. So after the U.S. established diplomatic relations, there are these talks about how we can, how the U.S. can sort of allow Vietnamese refugees to stay in the U.S. And then in 2008, there's actually an accord that was signed that protected people who had arrived in the U.S. before 1995. So basically, it was never passed into law, so people weren't fully protected. But both Bush and Obama kept re-signing this plan and allowing for Vietnamese refugees to stay in the U.S. And in the same sort of issues that we saw that I mentioned before with Mexicans who had been deported after having served in the military, access to the citizenship process is very, very difficult. And I would argue too, it might even be more difficult for Vietnamese refugees who haven't been able to learn English or who haven't found themselves because of how different the two languages are, and also because there's less of a network of Vietnamese. There's less of a smaller Vietnamese community than there is a Mexican American community. So I think those are two factors that limit Vietnamese refugees' access to the citizenship process even more so than we might be seeing with folks who were born in Mexico. So this case is interesting because they never got citizenship. They can technically be deported if they've committed an offense that's deportable. And that can be anything from having like a little tiny bag of marijuana on your person and having that be found by a police officer to anything from drunk driving to, there's a lot of other really minor offenses that people wouldn't consider deportable that are deportable offenses. And so these are reasons that ICE and other US government authorities can cite when they're saying that they can deport somebody. So one of the really interesting, I think, aspects of this case is that there's been kind of like a diplomatic brawl, you could say, between the U.S. and the Vietnamese governments. The Trump administration back in 2017 reversed that 2008 agreement that Bush and Obama had facilitated that would allow Vietnamese refugees to stay in the U.S. The Trump administration reversed that and made people who had arrived before 1995 eligible for deportation if they committed an offense. So that became a big issue for the Vietnamese community, and I think one of the most difficult or one of the most interesting aspects of this case is that the Vietnamese government also really didn't want to accept these people who were being threatened to be deported because they had been living in the U.S. for so long, so neither the Vietnamese government wanted these Vietnamese refugees, most of them who are older folks, nor did the U.S. government want them. So it became this really kind of difficult case that I think took a toll on a lot of people, right? Like if neither the place that you were born or the place that you've been living, wants you, right? Like that can be, I think pretty difficult for a lot of folks. So yeah, these two cases are both really interesting. And also with the case of veterans, and I would argue too that this is the case with the Vietnamese war refugees as well. A lot of them are experiencing prolonged post-traumatic stress disorder from what they saw in the case of veterans, what they went through as soldiers in in wars, and also in the case of the Vietnam War refugees, what they saw, right, in their home country during the Vietnam War. So in both cases, there are some serious, psychological effects of having seen such enormous, massive degrees of violence. And given the way the health system works in the U.S., there's limited access to mental health care. And so I think especially for older folks who have spent years kind of like dealing with these post-traumatic stress disorders, sometimes completely untreated, right? It creates a very difficult situation. And sometimes, especially this is widely cited in the case with veterans. To deal with this post-traumatic stress, to deal with all the things that were seen during the war, people unfortunately have no other choice but to turn to alcohol or to drugs, and that sometimes puts them in situations where they could be deported, right? So I think one of the big issues, especially with the case of the veterans, but I think this is applicable as well to the case of the Vietnam War refugees, is that the lack of access to healthcare and years upon years of prolonged accumulated stress create situations where folks kind of are put in situations where there's no other option to kind of deal with the sort of stress that they're experiencing. So interestingly enough, right, some of the offenses, some of the reasons why they've been deported are related to the lack of care that they've been given, even though they served the U.S. military or were displaced by the Vietnam War, in which the U.S. obviously had a very outsized role.
Well, this is very sobering. I mean, that's my first reaction. You are wise to point out that the post-traumatic stress syndrome is going to likely affect many of our vets, those who survived. Mm-hmm. So these are the people who survived, probably witnessing the death of people they knew well, perhaps loved ones in the cases of the Vietnamese, and comrades in the cases of our military. And they survived. They finally got to the U.S. They got back to the U.S. The Mexicans, after serving in these wars, coming back to the country that they had promised to look after, and then grown old in this country, and now are being deported. Mm-hmm. So despite their years of military service, despite their sacrifices, our government's official policy is you are not welcomed here.
Right, exactly, yeah. Sobering, I think, is a really good way to explain it, and I think especially because of how, like, discursively, how much support in the U.S. we give and provide to veterans. Obviously, in any debate, and when politicians always talk about veterans and what they're going to do for veterans, and this is a case of veterans who really have been completely ignored by the system, by politicians, and who have been treated horribly even after having put their lives on the line to defend the U.S.
And then in the case of the Vietnamese, I mean, coming from such a far away country and such a different culture in so many ways. Coming from Mexico to the US, it's a different culture too. It's a different language, very, very different systems. But as you mentioned, you're probably not the only Mexican who's in the United States. The Vietnamese people are in a different situation because there aren't as many of them here. And then the reasons that they're here, that they came to seek refuge here, are so, their lives were in peril where they were, in part because the U.S. was at war with the countries there. So it's a very tragic situation for the individuals and the families that are impacted. And it's a tragic situation, I believe, for the U.S. military. Because I bet that when those people were in the military fighting, their citizenship status was not an issue. They were there for each other, to help each other and support each other. And I'm just wondering how many veterans in the U.S., American veterans, know that their colleagues are being deported, maybe 40 years, 50 years, 60 years after having come here and served the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think when I sort of dived into these cases, I think I found it really interesting how there definitely was some media attention, and there definitely was some mobilization on the part of veterans with U.S. citizenship, but it wasn't enough to stop the deportations. So I always found it interesting that, you know, this would seem like, this of all cases would seem like the case where people would finally step up and be like, hey, you know, you've overstepped your boundaries, ICE, and you've overstepped your boundaries, U.S. government. Let's not, you know, let's find a way to make sure that these people have access to citizenship. But surprisingly, the deportations have continued. And despite the fact that there is, you know, support networks, right? Some veterans have donated to these organizations that work with deported vets in the northern border cities of Mexico. There's still a gap, I think, between, you know, the sort of support that you'd think that they'd be getting and the support in the support that they're getting, you know, in reality. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that maybe people just don't understand how difficult the process of reinserting yourself into the country you've been deported to can be. And especially for folks who were brought to the U.S. when they were kids, and who, you know, not only served in the U.S. military, but also, you know, went to schools in the U.S. and developed a sense of community around their identity. There's an interesting interview I was listening to about this one vet who was deported, who said that he never applied for citizenship because he always felt like he was from the U.S. So he never felt the need to apply for citizenship until it happened that he was deported, and his only protection would have been having had citizenship. So I find both of these cases interesting. In the case of the Vietnam War refugees, I find it is interesting as well because we look back on the Vietnam War kind of with a sense of shame, right? And like in retrospective horror at the sorts of things that happened during the Vietnam War, the violence that was caused, the millions of people that were killed and displaced. And yet, you know, when we have those people in front of us, in situations where they could be deported, there really hasn't been enough mobilization. So I think these two cases received more support than a lot of other groups of folks who have been deported, or who are being threatened with being deported. But still, it consistently surprises me how these deportations and how the threats of deportations have continued, despite the fact that these two cases you'd think, you know, would be the sorts of things that would you know, cause people to mobilize.
Do you think it's a matter that people just don't know, Americans just don't know that this is how our government is treating people who've served in the military or who have fled a country seeking refugee status? And so I suppose people could contact their elected representatives and ask them what's going on with this, or letting their elected representatives know how they feel about it. But you know, and then raising awareness, talking with other people about it, and
Right.
I guess contributing to the organizations that are trying to support people being deported, especially people being deported who fit into these two categories.
Yeah. I think definitely part of it is a lack of knowledge. I think probably a lack of like a more affective or emotional understanding of what these folks are going through after, when there's a big issue. We see this a lot in migration studies, where like there's not as much focus about what happens after you're deported, after you've been returned to your country involuntarily. There's a lot of information about what happens when you're in the US, but there's very little. It's hard to track people. It's hard to kind of compile information, and oftentimes people just get lost. There's one project that it's called TRAC out of Syracuse University, and they've done a really good job to try and follow people once they've been deported. And they've published some articles about the sorts of situations that people are faced with. But I just don't think people are aware of how difficult it is once you've been deported. There's almost like a wall, right? Where like once people have been deported, a wall comes up and you just don't think about them. And I think that's part of this issue. I think if more people understood, what it's like, how difficult it is to find a job, to access the healthcare system, there might be some more empathy. And I also think that like, especially with the case of the Vietnam War refugees, because this is like a relatively recent case. 2017 was when the Trump administration kind of decided to reverse this decades old policy. There's so much going on in the immigration space, so much negative rhetoric, so much such a large influx of information sent to our inboxes about immigration, people being deported, people being returned, people coming, right? This big influx of information that I think this case might have just gotten lost within it. I remember when I first heard about the case, it was right around when there were a lot of big changes, and I'm somebody who's been studying migration, right? And still it was one case of many other cases that was happening at the same time. So I really do think it kind of gets back to this idea, this difficulty of accessing, not only accessing the knowledge of the case, but also accessing like the sort of knowledge that's going to allow people to understand the realities that people face when they're deported back to a country that they haven't been to for 40 or 50 years. Sometimes they don't even speak the language fluently. And I think these are things that aren't unfortunately covered with the depth that they should be in like the mass media.
And both of these groups are likely to be older adults. At this
Exactly.
stage in their life, they're likely to be older adults.
Exactly.
And so without the benefits that happen with younger people who move to a new country where you might be going to school, getting an education with other people and meeting people, or having a very clear role, having a support system, a network, your family there. Many of these people who moved to the U.S. started their families in the U.S. and have family in the U.S. and now are returning to a place that they haven't called home for decades, and it's not the same place they left. Mm-hmm. And their role is not the same, and their ability to participate in that society has been greatly compromised, in part because they have adapted themselves to the U.S. situation, mm-hmm. and then surprisingly been deported.
Right.
They're maybe starting over again at 70, 72, 74 mm-hmm. years old. And you mentioned that the veterans lost their veterans pension.
Yeah. Once they were deported, they were outside of the jurisdiction of the U.S. and they lost their pension. So maybe some folks had some savings, right? But aside from that, like the pension that they probably had been relying on or depending on as part of their calculations for their future financially was taken away. And I know anecdotally too from the work that I did at a nonprofit up in Boston with citizenship type work. A lot of the lower income folks who we worked with who needed to apply for the fee waiver were older folks who had a difficult time finding a job or inserting themselves into the U.S., let alone a country that they have very little to no familiarity with. So I think, like when it comes to like your life savings and stuff, and a lot of these deportations, of course, too, are folks who live in states like California, which are really, really expensive. In Boston, for example, like the folks that we worked with, a lot of them needed assistance to pay for their apartment because the cost of living was so expensive. And they didn't have a lot of money for savings to save and to put aside. And so, when you're sent back with whatever, sometimes there is support from your family in the U.S. because in a lot of these cases, a lot of members of their family are in the U.S. Sometimes their children or their grandchildren are U.S. citizens, and they're being threatened with being sent back or sometimes being sent back. So there are you could say networks of support that could help people financially, but obviously if you're not in the same space as the person who's been returned or deported, you can't help with things like healthcare. You can't help with things like finding a doctor who's familiar with your case. Access to medication in general is a lot more difficult in Mexico and in a country like Vietnam than it might be in the U.S. So yeah, all these factors kind of come together to create really, really difficult situations, especially because sometimes these deportations happen really, really quickly, and you can't really plan for what's going to happen afterwards. Like there was one case that I remember reading about where this guy was found with a little bit of marijuana on him. He was sent to jail, and then right after being sent to jail, he was sent back to Mexico. So there's no time to plan to come up with like some sort of contingency plan to help facilitate reintegration into Mexico. It's just like, you're out of here. So these factors are difficult for anybody who's experiencing deportation, but for older folks, especially people in their 70s, people even in their, mid to late 60s, to say nothing about people in their 80s, right? Like these are really, really difficult circumstances.
Well, I want to thank you for bringing our attention, especially to these two cases. it's sad. It's truly sad that people signed up, put their life on the line, worked next to other members of the military, survived,
Mm-hmm.
and then are having their pension removed
Mm-hmm.
and being deported
Mm-hmm.
in their older adulthood. I mean, it's really sad.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for your work in this area and for being a strong advocate for people who are finding themselves in such vulnerable situations and truly life-threatening, because
Mm-hmm.
life as they knew it is over.
Mm-hmm.
And now they are in a situation where they have to start all over again without the same kind of resources that they had earned. I mean, there's no other way to say it. They'd earned that veteran's pension,
Mm-hmm.
and then with the stroke of a pen, the policies changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So, wow. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.